When we ask who is most responsible for the Second World War, one name immediately comes to mind: Adolf Hitler. As the leader of Germany, his aggressive expansionist policies were a direct cause of the conflict. From the remilitarization of the Rhineland to the annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia, Hitler consistently challenged the international order established after World War I. His political and military decisions created a climate of constant tension and fear across Europe. The final straw was the invasion of Poland in September 1939. This act of aggression is almost universally seen as the direct trigger for the war, as it prompted Britain and France to declare war on Germany. Historians overwhelmingly agree that Hitler was the central figure, the primary instigator whose actions pushed the world into its deadliest conflict. It's crucial to understand his role, not to glorify it, but to analyze the chain of events he set in motion. Without his relentless drive for expansion and ideological dominance, it's hard to imagine the war unfolding as it did. But was Hitler the only cause? To truly understand the origins of the war, we have to look further back, to the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. Signed in 1919, this treaty was intended to bring peace. But many argue it sowed the seeds for another war. It imposed incredibly harsh terms on Germany. The country was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, pay massive reparations, and give up significant territory. Perhaps most humiliating were the severe restrictions placed on its military. The German army was limited to just 100,000 men, and its navy and air force were drastically cut down. This created deep-seated resentment and a sense of national humiliation among the German people. These feelings of injustice and pressure created a fertile breeding ground for extremist political movements that promised to restore Germany's honor and strength. Many scholars now believe the treaty, while well-intentioned from the victor's perspective, ultimately destabilized Europe and contributed to the rise of the very forces it sought to prevent. Another critical piece of the puzzle is the global economic crisis of the 1930s, known as the Great Depression. It began with the Wall Street crash of 1929 and quickly spread across the world, hitting Germany particularly hard. The German economy, already fragile from the war and reparations, collapsed. Businesses failed, unemployment skyrocketed, and hyperinflation made people's savings worthless. This widespread economic hardship completely discredited the democratic Weimar Republic. People lost faith in traditional political parties and their ability to solve the crisis. In times of desperation, radical ideologies often become more appealing. People were looking for strong leaders and simple solutions to complex problems. This economic turmoil made the promises of extremist groups, who offered scapegoats and a vision of national revival, seem much more attractive to a suffering population. The worldwide economic instability also fueled political tensions between nations. As countries turned inward and protectionist policies damaged international trade and cooperation, this leads us to the rise of extreme nationalism and fascist ideology, not just in Germany, but across Europe. In the wake of World War I, many people were disillusioned with democracy and liberalism, which they blamed for the war and its chaotic aftermath. Fascism emerged as a powerful alternative. This ideology rejected democratic principles, individual liberties, and international cooperation. Instead, it championed the idea of a powerful, authoritarian state led by a single charismatic leader. It promoted an aggressive, militaristic form of nationalism that glorified war and expansion. This extreme nationalism convinced people that their nation was superior and had the right to dominate others. It created a political environment where diplomatic negotiations and compromise were seen as signs of weakness. This ideological shift was a major factor in the breakdown of international relations. The rejection of democracy meant that conflicts were more likely to be resolved through force rather than dialogue, setting the stage for a continent-wide confrontation. And we can't forget the role of other key players, particularly Benito, Mussolini, and Fascist Italy. Mussolini, who came to power in 1922, was a pioneer of fascism and an inspiration for other dictators. Under his rule, Italy pursued its own expansionist ambitions, invading Ethiopia in 1935 and Albania in 1939. These actions contributed to the general atmosphere of lawlessness and aggression in Europe. More importantly, Mussolini formed a crucial alliance with Hitler. The Pact of Steel, signed between Germany and Italy in 1939, created the foundation of the Axis powers. This strategic alliance it meant that any conflict involving Germany would likely draw in Italy, expanding the scope of the war. The Axis alliance also strengthened the military capabilities of its members, making them a more formidable threat to the Allied powers. Mussolini's fascist policies and his partnership with Germany were instrumental in shaping the political and military landscape that led directly to the outbreak of war. So, who was most responsible? As we've seen, the answer is complex. Adolf Hitler and his aggressive policies were undoubtedly the immediate trigger. His decisions and actions were the spark that lit the flame. However, that spark fell on a landscape that was already saturated with flammable material. The Treaty of Versailles had created a deep well of resentment and instability in Germany. The Great Depression devastated economies and pushed desperate people toward radical solutions. The rise of extreme nationalism and fascist ideology provided the philosophical justification for aggression and conquest, and the actions of other leaders, like Mussolini, helped create a powerful alliance ready for war. You can't really isolate one cause from the others. It was a perfect storm, a convergence of political, economic, and ideological factors that created the conditions for the Second World War. Each factor played a crucial role in this tragic chapter of human history. Understanding this complex web of causes is essential for us to learn from the past and strive for a more peaceful future. Who was really responsible for the Second World War? When we think of this question, one name often comes to mind. But history is rarely that simple. The reality is that the world was a tinderbox, and countless factors, not just one person, lit the fuse. Over the next 10 minutes, we are going to dive deep into the complex web of causes that led to the most devastating conflict in human history. We'll explore the failures, the ambitions, and the systemic pressures that pushed nations toward war. This isn't about pointing fingers at a single villain, but about understanding the big picture. So, let's go beyond the headlines and explore the real reasons behind World War II. Let's start with the international system, designed to prevent another great war. The League of Nations, created with noble intentions after World War I. Its goal was to ensure global peace through collective security. The idea was simple. An attack on one member was an attack on all, and the international community would respond together. Sounds good on paper, right? The problem was, the League had no teeth. It lacked its own military force and had no real power to enforce its decisions. When a country acted aggressively, the League could only issue condemnations or impose economic sanctions, which were often ineffective because not all major powers were even members. The United States, for instance, never joined, which significantly weakened the organization from the very beginning. As tensions began to simmer in the 1930s, the League's limited authority meant it was mostly a bystander. Early acts of aggression were met with weak responses, sending a clear message to expansionist powers that there would be few consequences for their actions. This failure of the world's security system created a power vacuum, allowing conflicts that could have been contained to grow and eventually merge into a global war. It wasn't about a lack of will from everyone, but a structural inability to act decisively. While Europe was dealing with its own set of problems, another major conflict was brewing on the other side of the world. In the Asia-Pacific region, Japan was on the rise. As an island nation with limited natural resources, Japan's rapidly industrializing economy depended heavily on imports. To secure resources like oil, rubber, and iron, and to establish itself as the dominant power in Asia, Japan embarked on an aggressive expansionist policy. This Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as it was called, was promoted as a bloc of Asian nations led by Japan and free from Western colonial influence. However, in practice, it meant military expansion into neighboring territories. This created immediate friction with China and other Asian nations. But it also put Japan on a collision course with Western powers like the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands, who had their own colonial and economic interests in the region. Japan's actions in Asia weren't happening in a vacuum. They were part of a growing global pattern of aggression. The widening tensions in the Pacific became a crucial part of the worldwide conflict, turning what might have been separate regional wars into a truly global one. Historians often point to these economic and geopolitical motivations as a key driver, separate from but parallel to the events unfolding in Europe. This brings us to a core issue that fueled much of the conflict: the intense competition for power and resources. The world in the 1920s and 30s was not a level playing field. Some nations, like the British and French empires, controlled vast global territories, rich in raw materials. Others, like Germany, Italy, and Japan, felt they had been left behind. They were have-not nations, facing significant barriers to accessing the resources needed to fuel their industries and economies. The Great Depression made this situation even worse. Global trade collapsed, and countries raised tariffs, making it incredibly difficult to buy and sell goods. For nations with limited domestic resources, expansion seemed like the only viable path to economic security and national greatness. They believed that to be a great power, they needed to control their own sources of raw materials and markets. This economic pressure drove expansionist strategies and created a fierce rivalry for territory and influence. This competition strained diplomatic relations to the breaking point. It wasn't just about ideology. It was a structural problem. The unequal distribution of resources created a zero-sum game in the minds of many leaders, where one nation's gain had to be another's loss. Scholars see this as a fundamental factor that created a climate of instability and made war increasingly likely. Another critical piece of the puzzle is the political structure of the countries involved. In the years leading up to the war, several key nations, including Germany, Italy, and Japan, moved toward totalitarian or authoritarian systems of government. In these systems, power was highly concentrated in the hands of a single leader or a small elite group. Parliaments were weakened or abolished. Political opposition was suppressed, and there were few, if any, checks and balances on government power. This had profound implications for foreign policy. Leaders could make rapid, decisive, and often radical decisions without the need for public debate or democratic approval. There was no independent press or opposition party to question a move towards war. This concentration of authority allowed for swift and unchecked policy shifts, which made these nations unpredictable and aggressive on the world stage. For other countries, it was incredibly difficult to gauge their intentions or trust their diplomatic promises. This lack of transparency and democratic oversight created an environment of intense international uncertainty and suspicion. Political analysts often highlight how these internal governance structures directly shaped foreign policy decisions, enabling a small group of individuals to steer their entire nations down the path to war, a path that might have been debated or rejected in a more open democratic system. Finally, we have to talk about the policy of appeasement. Faced with rising aggression in the 1930s, the major European powers, particularly Britain and France, were desperate to avoid another devastating war. The memory of World War I was still fresh, and the public was overwhelmingly anti-war. In this context, they adopted a strategy of appeasement. The idea was to grant concessions to aggressive powers in the hope that it would satisfy their demands and preserve the peace. They pursued diplomatic negotiations and made compromises, believing it was a reasonable way to address grievances and prevent a full-blown conflict. For a time, it seemed like a pragmatic approach. However, each concession seemed to only embolden the aggressors, who saw it as a sign of weakness and a green light for further expansion. The policy of appeasement bought time, but it didn't solve the underlying problems. In fact, it arguably made them worse. By delaying a firm response, the Western powers allowed the military and strategic balance of power to shift against them. When they finally decided that a line had to be drawn, the situation was far more dangerous and difficult to control. Historians today generally view appeasement not as a cowardly act, but as a tragic miscalculation born out of a genuine desire for peace. It's a powerful example of how well-intentioned policies can have unintended and catastrophic consequences, unintentionally allowing tensions to escalate beyond the point of no return. So, as we look back, The question of who was responsible for World War II becomes far more complex. It wasn't just the actions of one leader or one nation. It was a perfect storm of systemic failures. The League of Nations was too weak to enforce peace. Major powers like Japan were driven by economic needs to expand their empires. The global competition for scarce resources created a powder keg of rivalries. The rise of totalitarian governments concentrated immense power in the hands of a few, removing crucial checks and balances. And the policy of appeasement, meant to prevent war, ultimately allowed the aggressors to become stronger. Each of these factors was a thread in a vast, tangled web. Pulling on any one thread would have caused ripples, but together they created an unstoppable momentum toward global conflict. Understanding these deep, structural causes doesn't excuse the actions of any individual or nation, but it does give us a clearer, more complete picture of how the world stumbled into its darkest chapter. It's a crucial lesson from history. Peace is fragile, and it depends on a stable international system, economic fairness, responsible governance, and the courage to confront aggression before it's too late. Thanks for watching. And if you found this deep dive interesting, be sure to like and subscribe for more historical analysis.